study my culture. So today I welcome you all to our discussion panel dealing with the Durban Conference of 2001 as we check into that, see what has been done and what can we do to make it better. So once again, I thank you and I welcome you all. Mr. Ross Calhoun will be our facilitator this afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy that everyone could come out. This year, on December of 2010, it was declared that 2011 would become the International Year for African Descendants. This was declared by the United Nations. Now, this came about as a result of what Brother Leon just pointed out, the conference that took place in Durban, South Africa in 2001 from August to September the 8th of 2001. This was the conference against the World Conference Against Racism and xenophobia and many of the other things that have taken place in racial discrimination. Now, out of this conference, there became a declaration that would go for 10 years, that they would allocate this year, declare this year as the International Year for African Descendants. And in commemorating this, we wanted to bring forth people to discuss this, because the question always occurred. You know, Dr. Martin Luther King once raised that question. He says, where do we go from here? Chaos or community, in one of his books. And today we're very honored to have Professor Randall from the University of Dayton Law School. And she was a participant at this conference in Durban. Commissioner Dean Lovelace is supposed to be with us this evening. I don't know what has happened, but he was also attending that conference. So we're going to have a real eyewitness of what came out of the conference, and and we'll just be discussing the things that transpired from that time to this time and how it all affects us. So at this time, we're going to just look at a little clip of some of the declaration that came about from the conference and how this International Year for African Descendants, how it's transpiring to the day.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm speaking on behalf of the International Humanist Ethical Union and its more than 100 member organizations in over 40 countries. Mr. President, the Durban Review Conference can claim some success in that the outcome document contains no toxic passages, and because some issues that have no place in human rights discourse have been eliminated. But sadly, and despite the magnificent efforts made by so many, the conference will be seen by many more as a failure. A failure to offer hope to the hundreds of millions of our fellow humans suffering from racism every day of their lives. On slavery, we've heard of the evils of trafficking, but not a single word of the more than 1 million people born into and living in chattel slavery in Africa. We've heard of the transatlantic slave trade, but not one word of the millions trafficked into slavery in North Africa, the Middle East, and across the Indian Ocean. Trades that persisted for over 1,000 years and that left at least 3 people dead for every one of the tens of millions who actually reached the slave markets. On state-sponsored racism, verging on genocide, there's not a single word about Darfur or other situations crying out for redress. On religious hatred, we've heard only of discrimination and hatred towards Muslims, Christians, and Jews. But what of the worldwide discrimination, violence, and even death that awaits non-believers, skeptics, atheists, apostates, and freethinkers in far too many countries? People whose only crime has been to think for themselves and have been born in the wrong place. Finally, Mr. President, the world will want to know why the outcome document has totally ignored the most intractable form of racism on earth, affecting more than 250 million people worldwide. I refer, of course, to the scourge of untouchability. How can any state here justify such blindness? I would add that IATU will be continuing the fight for human rights with a World Conference on Untouchability to be held in London on the 9th and 10th of June this year. Yes, Mr. President, there has been progress, but the conference has been tainted by selectivity and bias. The international community must now move forward not only on what's been agreed here, but on what's been omitted.
So at this time, I want to introduce the members of the panel that will be Professor Randall from University of Dayton, and Dr. Boyka Tway, the head of the African American Studies Department, Psychology Department here at St. Clair. You come forward. And we're going to have to make one adjustment, that Commissioner Dean Lovelace will not be able to be with us this evening. But I know he's with us in spirit, so we'll move right along. Now at this time also, we just want to take one moment, for a moment of silence, to remember all of the victims of the transatlantic slave trade. Many of our heroes and sheroes that gave their life for the betterment of the people of color that are here in the Americas, in the Caribbean, in Africa, and to the carnage that is presently going on in the streets of Americas, in the Americas and the Caribbean and Africa. Just have this moment of silence, to commemorate their loss. Okay, thank you. Now at this time, we'd like to introduce Professor Randall, who is a participant, and she's done a lot of work with the United Nations on behalf of the conditions that have been facing the black people, particularly here in North America, here in the Americas. And at this time, we're just going to let her talk a little bit about the conference that took place in Durban and some of the other works that she has done.
Thank you so much. Is this on? Yeah. Now, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. My participation in the World Conference in 2001 was something that was an amazing experience. And not only attending the conference, but the prep cons. That is all, they have conferences in order to prepare for it. And I was able to get involved in that largely by attending a meeting much like this, where people were saying, how are we going to prepare for the PrepCon? It was in Atlanta, and they said they didn't have anyone to do the health unit. And so I said, I'll do it, because that's my background. And little did I know that by taking that on, I would end up being the International Chair for Health at the World Conference. But I want to back up, because I want to talk about the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action that no one knows about. And it's an amazing declaration of people of African descent. It occurred April 28th in 2001 in Vienna, Austria. 135 African and African descendants from non-governmental organizations attended. We gathered because we all felt like that the preparation wasn't dealing with the issues of African descent. And I have to tell you that it was a 2-day conference, and at the time, I thought, I didn't know there was Chinese Africans. And I didn't, I did not know that there, you know about Africans descendants being all up and down the Americas, but little do we realize that African descendants are in almost every country because they've immigrated in the 20th century, largely for schooling. And then in Europe, of course, there was the slave trade where there are descendants that from the early European slave trade. But we came to this meeting. There were representatives from Europe. There was representatives from Africa, from Asia, and from America, and it came clear that we all had two things at least in common. One, that we had a connection of either direct descent or historical descent to Mother Africa. And two, that wherever we were, we experienced anti-Black racism. We could not fully understand the language that different people were saying, but we understood they got stopped by cops more, they had the educational systems discriminated. It didn't. I met a young man from Sweden whose parents had been there for 2 generations. And what he talked about was that no matter, that people still treat him as the outsider. Even though he'd been there, his parents had been there for 2 generations. So leading up to this, I wanted to give a little bit of background about what the conferences that led up to that. There is a treaty, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. It's a human rights treaty out of the UN. Countries who sign it are legally obligated to enforce it in their country. The treaty came about in 1966, and the United States signed it in 67. But because of the way we sign human rights treaties, that is, we will not allow the president to sign a treaty and for it to become a force of law without the Senate ratification. So it's a non-binding treaty until the Senate ratified it. When do you think the Senate ratified it? 1995. Think about that. 30 years before the Senate would say, we will eliminate all forms of racial discrimination. So, out of the treaty, there were 2 prior conferences held in relationship to this. Both of the conferences dealt almost exclusively with apartheid in South Africa. And so there was no room to address issues of other people, of people of African descent. So this conference, and this is one of the reasons why there was such a volatile kind of atmosphere. This was the first conference that people all over the world were going to be able to air their particular problems. Now, when I talk about the World Conference of African Descent, World Conference Against Racism, you have to realize it's really 2 conferences. There's a non-governmental conference and a government conference. Most of the press that was negative was non-governmental. It was non-governmental people protesting, petitioning each other. So it would be much like us sitting here having a discussion about non-African, people of African descent, and another group protesting this, and then the press saying the city of Dayton had protests. City of Dayton didn't have any protests. What had a protest was us, our group. And what went on that. And the press mostly focused on the Palestinian-Israeli dispute. But back to the Vienna Conference, Vienna Declaration. So we decided to have a meeting in Vienna to put together a declaration that was specific to African descent that could be used to govern what was done as in the non-governmental conference and in the government conference. And I wanted to understand how important this was. The European Union, in preparation for the 2001 conference, has been saying, and they still do for that matter, and it's the road that we're on now, we don't have racists. How can we collect data about discrimination on race when we don't have racists? There's only one race, the human race. And you cannot collect data on a subset of one. You need groups. And since there are we don't recognize that there are any other race but the human race, we can't collect data. So what happened then is that the European Union's declaration of action going into the conference, for instance, mentioned Romas, mentioned Jews, mentioned immigration, mentioned dialects. What didn't it mention? It did not mention people of African descent at all. Now there was terms that you could argue applied to us, but it didn't call our name and say this is the situation in which they live in our society and we're going to do something about it. And so as people of African descent, we met in Vienna to do that, to address that issue, to address that lack of focus on anti-Black racism. Needless to say, the governments of the United States, which, by the way, people said they boycotted the World Conference, the World Conference, but they boycotted every World Conference there is. The United States manages to find a reason not to participate in World Conferences against racism. And we can have a discussion about why that may be. But they didn't participate in the first World Conference, they didn't participate in the second World Conference, and they didn't participate in the World Conference in Durban. So we had this Vienna meeting, and the first day was presentations and everything. The second day we decided to draft and approve. I was the chairperson responsible for drafting the document. We drafted the document, and then over a course of a couple of months, we, through email with everyone who participated at the conference and other people, we sent a declaration around to refine it. I want to read a few things to you, and then I'll talk about what happened at the conference and what's happening now. I want to read the preamble to the declaration. It says, Africans and African descendants share a common historical and cultural heritage. The richness of African history has been distorted and the African cultural identity ridiculed by many. As people of Africa, we want to revive the presentation of African history and promote pride in our African identity, as well as celebrating the diversity of our peoples. Africans and African descendants also share the history of slave trade, slavery, and colonization, and a common experience of anti-Black racism. I'm going to stop this and editorialize. I really think we got to name it. Right. If we don't start talking about anti-black racism, if we keep talking about racism, we will never force people to deal with anti-black racism, which is different than other kinds of racism. We recognize that people of African descent live on all world continents, although they have been renamed, suppressed, and marginalized. All over the world, Africans continue to be subject to racism, discrimination, and intolerance. It is the complexity of these common roots and experiences that binds us together as a community. And as a community, we are committed to having the world recognize and provide reparation for the Black Holocaust. You can imagine the discussion over using the word Holocaust. Eliminating anti-black racism everywhere it occurs in any part of the world, and restoring our motherland, Africa, to its full glory. Then the document goes on to take each of those points and really spell out the particulars of why we think this is important. We adopted it, and it became a tool that was used by, it became a tool that was used at the World Conference, the non-governmental conference, for other African groups to draft components that they were going to address. It is sad that the conference was taken over by the media to present it in a way that it was presented. It was an effective conference that addressed the issues that people wanted to address. It allowed voice for people who had been marginalized. It came up with schemes for both groups, like people of African descendants, and common problems like healthcare. We had a healthcare conference to draft a similar program of action that included 250 people from around the world, and the problems of healthcare are common across country, common across group. And the reason I think the World Conference is successful is because it allowed both of those things. It said, yes, you are unique as people of African descent, Latinos, Asian, American Indians, Dalits, Roma, Jews, Palestinians. Yes, you are unique, and you have problems in a way that should be voiced independently and separately from other groups. But there's also a common problem of oppression, that when people are oppressed, whatever they're oppressing you on, you find the same symptoms. Recently, about a year ago, I went to visit my youngest son in England, and his girlfriend is Irish, and he was living, his then girlfriend was Irish, and he was living with her and a couple of young Irish people. And we were in England, and they were getting into a fierce discussion about oppression and discrimination by the English. And how oppression and discrimination, and they got so excited that one of the kids said, and you will just never understand what that kind of oppression is like. And my son said, really? You think so? And then he realized that he actually was talking to someone who had experienced that kind of oppression and more. Okay? But the common thing is that we have to remember that is that the symptoms and signs of oppression crosses groups. The media, the mainstream media, decided that the battle between the Israelis and the Palestinians was the battle. And the interesting thing is, this was the first time that you both had an oppressor and a victim group. So the Israelis, the Jews, have been oppressed as Jewish people. They've been oppressed. But as Israelis, they are oppressors of the Palestinians. And there's a distinction to saying Jews have been oppressed, Israelis oppressed. And this is the first time that you had a group that, the Jewish group, who was also Israeli, so either Israelis themselves or Israeli supporters. So they're at the non-governmental thing, and you have the Palestinians. So you can imagine the conflict that went on between those two groups. Other groups didn't have that problem. The United States was not sitting in our governmental meetings, and the white people showed up in the African American group weren't trying to say, I've been oppressed too. Recognize my oppression. They were just saying, how can I help you? Whereas in the Israeli-Palestine conflict, there was a conflict over, we are oppressing you, we've had the worst oppression. So the media decided to focus on that. And then the governmental agencies, okay, because this ain't happening in their arena. This is kind of like over here we got all those troublemakers, non-governmental people, and away, way across, half a mile away, you got the government's meeting. Okay, ain't no protest going on at the government meeting. You can't even get into that and protest. It's okay, so they have them badges, and they don't let 6 people in, and you got to let your things there, and their meetings were all closed off. So there really wasn't any protest going on at the government. But what happened is that the governmental agencies decided to use that protest as a way to walk out of the government conference. And to use, I guess I should say there was some conflict. It just wasn't of the same nature, because you had the same problem. You had Israelis and Palestinians in the government both saying they wanted recognition and victim, and the Israelis saying we do not want to be identified as oppressors. And so you had governments who walked out, but the United States didn't even participate. So, for people of African descent, it was a successful conference. We had a meeting, a world conference. We had a PrepCon meeting. We generated a document that would be used. We got language in the governmental document. It wasn't as strong as we would like it on the issues of reparations, because the United States scared the hell out of everybody and about putting the word reparations in, but we got other things in the document. And from there, we then we got a commitment for a committee to study the status of people of African descent. That commitment has been continuing for 10 years, but I'm concerned that they are going to end it soon if we don't do something. They snuck into the United States and did a study of the United States and snuck out without really telling us. And I don't know if that was a condition of coming in, because the UN can't come into a country unless a country invites them. So the UN can't come in and study the status of a group of people unless the country says you can come in and do that. And so when the committee came in, perhaps the condition of coming in was, we're not going to do a big, we're not going to do a big thing. You can come into a few cities and do your thing there. But there wasn't, I didn't even learn about it. And so then this year, people of African descent, again, very low key, very, no big announcements. In our country has done zero on in terms of recognition, addressing this people of African descent. What I'd like to do now is sort of turn it over, and then we in the discussion period, based on your questions, I can address things fuller.
I'd like to I'd like to direct a question to Dr. Tway. Dr. Tway is a son of Africa, in the sense we are all sons and daughters of Africa, but he was a son that was born in Africa. And I'd like to ask him the question, how do you see Africa being portrayed now in today's world, you know, where you see so many things happening, with so many divisions that are going on, and what seems to be the media's response to Africa is death and suffering and war. And, you know, by you being born in a place that just underwent a terrific civil war, I'd like you to maybe talk a little bit about your impressions of how Africa is being portrayed and how Africa is for real.
Well, thank you for your question, Ross. The portrayal of Africa right now, and in fact for a long time, has been based on the corporate media. And the corporate media is controlled by corporations that are exploiting Africa. In fact, a case, a very good case would be the case of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. You have not perhaps heard anything about what's going on in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but that is a part of Africa that has the world's greatest natural resources in terms of most of the key minerals that you find in your cell phone, that you find in your laptop, the laptop or cell phone you're using, that comes directly from the Congo. All of the major corporations around the world are in the Congo right now, exploiting those resources for free. They're not paying anybody. They got an army protecting their operations there. You will not hear that. And in fact, as a result, we have, perhaps in the last decade, almost 5 million Congolese. We're not talking about other Africans. Almost 5 million Congolese died as a result of this. You do not hear it because the corporations that are actually responsible for the death of the Congolese are the ones who own the media. So you will not hear it on CNN. You're not going to hear it on the 6 o'clock news. You will not hear that, in fact, Africans are paying this kind of high price for the luxury items that we all enjoy, like your cell phone and your laptop. Recently we heard about what's going on in North Africa, and particularly if we look at Libya, for example. The media portrays this whole issue as some kind of popular uprising.
Right.
We want to see what's the popular uprising. Who are the people that are uprising? The impression we get is that this is major corporations and governments who have an interest in trying to control the resources of Libya. France, for example. So again, what the media tells you is really what they want you to know. And what you have actually in America here is the media attempt to literally keep you in the dark, keep you ignorant. So unless you go for media outside of the U.S., you really don't know what's happening in Africa and the rest of the world. So that's, again, last week, Friday, I was here at Sinclair talking about Liberia, which is my home country. And many of you sitting in the audience may not even know about Liberia or what Liberia is. But Liberia was a country that was established by America, by the U.S. Marines going in and grabbing land to transport African Americans back to Africa. Have you heard about that? Most African Americans have never heard about Liberia. And many of you have gone to 12 years of schools and in college. You've never heard of this place that America literally created to transport African stove. This is the kind of blackout we're talking about in terms of the education and the media and all that. And when in the case of Liberia, when we were faced with civil crisis, we falsely thought that America was going to help us because this is most Liberians think that this is our father. They're the one who set this place up. And America watched us literally go down the tube. In fact, they were literally arming both sides of the civil crisis. And so this is, and I don't know if you heard it in the media. In fact, I had to go back to the continent of Africa to actually find out what was going on the continent because I was there in Southern Africa. And so every day at least there was an update of what was going on in Africa. But you would never hear that in the news here about what's going on, except if it's Libya, because we don't have the kind of resources that Libya has, so we're not going to get into the news. The Congo has the resources, but they don't want to tell you why they're there, why the fighting is occurring. So these are some of the issues that that is occurring in Africa, at least the burning issues.
Dr. Randall, I wanted to ask you a question that occurred at the conferences. Was there any discussion on genocide? Because even right now, many of the indigenous peoples of Africa are moved to the brink of extinction. The ones that I'm speaking of now is like the Pastorius, the Maasai, the Turkanas, the ones that they nicknamed the Bushmen, the San people in the Kalahari deserts, and like he mentioned in the Congo, you're talking about the Twa people that are, that they're saying that they have been living for some point for millions and thousands, at least we know thousands and thousands of years living off the land, and now all of a sudden modernization and the people that want the land are uprooting them. And like you was pointing out, the other struggles that are going on with people that they're nicknamed the Dalits in India, these are really indigenous people to that part. Were there any discussions about genocide?
Well, again, at the non-governmental governmental part, there was not only discussion, but if you read the non-governmental document that came out of the World Conference, it's mentioned in the words. But you have to remember that genocide has a legal meaning, and so the governments did not want to say in a legal document anything about genocide because there are other treaties that give legal give responsibility. So the governmental documents talked about oppression and racism and death and all of that stuff, but they did not use the word genocide. The interesting thing that came out of the United, one of the big issues with the United States for what they walked out had to do with indigenous peoples, here in the United States. There is a treaty, there is under international law serious sovereignty rights and other rights of people for indigenous peoples. So if you recognize a group as indigenous peoples, then from that flows a lot of rights that they have. The United States, amazingly enough, has fought declaring Native Americans indigenous peoples under human rights law. And one of the big fights was for the United States reparations. They didn't want any. I think the United States didn't. I think the United States used the conflict over Israel and Palestine as a reason to walk out that the real reason they didn't want to be there is they didn't want to have to put on record their opposition to reparations in a way that and maybe be voted down, and they didn't want to have to put on record their opposition to indigenous peoples. Which, this is kind of an aside. I've been slowly toying with the idea of black indigenous, that people of African descent who had their history out of American slavery are indigenous. I'll throw this out. The reason I say that is that we cannot point to a state or a country or a tribe from which we come. And that we are really a group that was made here on this land. I mean, it wasn't like the Irish who came over here as poor, and they had an identity before they came. And yes, that identity changed from being on this land, but they had an identity that was Irish, and that identity continues as the Irish. African Americans who have their history out of slavery do not exist as a group anywhere except in this country.
Right.
And that makes us indigenous to this country. We have African roots, but so do Native Americans have Asian roots, but they're indigenous to this country. So I really want us to begin to think of ourselves as indigenous Americans, not in competition with Native Americans. They certainly have a claim that is prior to us, and they were here, and the American westward thing almost completely wiped them off the earth. But I think that just like we can call the transatlantic slave trade a Holocaust, we can say that because of the nature of who we are indigenous. And I think that's important, that people understand that when they talk about black people, there are different groups of black people, and some of us are indigenous, and that's not to make a distinction in groups. It's just to say that we are indigenous to America.
Yes.
Indigenous, not by your own will either.
Yeah.
So in that sense, everything, thank you. I was going to say indigenous, not by your own will either. And what you really need to do is to tell people that your whole entire history has been erased. And by saying that you're indigenous to the United States, that makes a difference. It gives you an identity. I mean, people call it an identity to become something better and to look at yourselves as Americans in a sense. However, if you're from an Afrocentric point of view, I think all of us are African, and we have to recognize that, whether we be white, black, or whatever, and that's the view I share with Dr. Sweat.
We have a
Yeah, this is a comment, basically, just kind of responding to what you said. Historically, Dr. Martin Lane, who was the first black officer of the Civil War, buried over here in Wilberforce, he was jet black, could trace his ancestry directly back to Africa through stories his mother and his grandmother told. And yet, when he went to Africa to make a treaty with the Egba and Abiyakuta, he did it as a foreigner, making a treaty with the Egba Abiyakuta. He wasn't considered, in other words, he doesn't have the identity of any African nation, even though he knows he's an African. He's treated as an African from America. In a book by a fellow named Tunde Adeleke, who's a Nigerian, he calls Delaney, Garnett, and all the other black nationalists of that era of the 19th century, he calls them un-African Americans. That's the name of the book, which I disagree with, but that's his book. Delaney, in 1852, did something. He was an inventor and a scientist, among other things. He was a medical doctor. He wrote the first black novel in the United States. He did a lot of things. But he invented an air brake for trains, and he and Dr. James McCune Smith tried to get the brake patented, but he was told by the U.S. government that he couldn't have a patent because he was not a citizen. This is 1852. And they said, well, he said, well, how can I get it patented? I'm not a citizen of the United States because I'm a colored American, but how can I get it patented? He said, well, I don't think you have a chance, because if you were a citizen of any nation on earth, you could get a patent in the U.S. as a foreign national. But we don't even have a category for you. You have you're the man without a country. You're the Philip Nolan. You know, white folks wrote a book about a guy. Who wrote the book about the man without a country? His name was Philip Nolan. He was a white American who became disenfranchised from his country. Black folks have been disenfranchised from the very beginning. And the civil rights movement is about trying to get our rights. And we still are still struggling to achieve. And I have a question, though, too. I just wondered are you talking about a conference that took place this summer, or are you talking about
the 2001 World Conference?
Oh, yes,
in Durban, and the lead up to that.
Right. I thought that's what I was in, but I thought maybe something else had happened. My question is that, do you think the new administration of Barack Obama is going to make any difference in terms of how black folks are recognized internationally?
Yeah, I think he's going to make a difference. He's going to make it worse. I believe that part of what's happened is that, for whatever reasons, and I don't really, that on an international scene, Obama had a chance to, there was a follow-up meeting on, related to the International Convention on Eliminating all forms of racial discrimination. At the beginning of the year that he went in, and he
2009.
That's right. And he chose to say, I can't support Durban because Durban was so conflict-ridden.
Right.
Okay. That he, you know, he has there's been what's called a universal periodic review that just occurred this year. The United Nations adopted a new way of dealing with whether or not people are meeting their treaty obligations. And what they decided to do is do a review process every 4 years of every nation. And so the universal is called UPR, Universal Periodic Review. Obama had more activity than Bush would have had, probably about the same as Clinton, but it was very, very controlled in order to keep voices out, in order to say, we don't want to have involvement of people who are really going to be critical of us, okay? I'm involved in the U.S. Human Rights Network, and I was involved in putting together the review on health critique. And so we submitted a shadow document. And it basically, the document out of Hillary Clinton, Obama, the State Department basically said, we walk on water. Oh yeah, we got a few problems in our country that we can deal with, but we have the laws needed to address those problems. And maybe there hasn't been as much of enforcement that we want, but we will get around to enforcing them sometime. And so part of the problem, I think, that Obama presents to us as people of African descent is the same kind of racism that has always occurred. Is that when you get a person of African descent in power, any kind of power, mayor, head of a corporation,
head of department. Head of department.
Head of department. It doesn't really matter. You know, it's true. Teacher in the classroom. It doesn't really matter. If you get a person of African descent, an African of descent in some kind of power, and that person articulates colorblind positions, then white people who will not like that, because it relieves them of responsibility, and it allows the liberal white colorblind person to be relieved of responsibility. And the problem with Obama is that Europe is liking what he's doing, and he's not really doing all that. I mean, he's doing, I don't want to say nothing, next to nothing. You know, he does enough so that you can't say he didn't do anything. But what he does is so little that you wish he would do nothing, so you could just say he did nothing, right? And so I think he makes it. He's making it worse. There is a review. The International Treaty on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination requires a 2-year review once you sign it. Okay? Now, remember, we signed it in 1995. So 1995 to now, how long is that? 16 years. How many reviews should we have done? How many we've done? 2. And the third one is coming up next year. So one of the things that can happen, first of all, we already know that the State Department is going to put the best light, even under Obama, for racial discrimination. They're not going to call out the United States and make a change. But one of the things that happens is non-governmental organizations can submit a shadow report, and they can testify. And so here's my idea, is that we do a shadow report that uses Dayton as a case study. What is happening to people of African descent? We don't have to go nowhere. We can talk about what's happening. It's happening right here. Unemployment, foreclosures, no jobs, education system falling apart, no grocery stores in our community, no health care, you know, incarceration. It's all here. We become a real life case study that is different than the reports we do. Is we talk about the overall statistics, and it seems to me that what we would do is something different. And then, and this is the reason I'm saying, because y'all need to start saving for it, because we need to do it. Then we take a delegation to Geneva, and we present our report. We participate in the committee that's reviewing the United States, and we give testimony directly using us and Dayton as an example of what's happening to the black people and why the treaty isn't working here.
We actually have a clip from President Obama concerning the boycott. Confronting the Durban Conference.
Here's the problem. You had a previous conference. I believe it was in 2001, maybe it was 2002. I think it was 2001, in which it became a session through which folks expressed antagonism towards Israel in ways that were oftentimes completely hypocritical and counterproductive. And we expressed in the run-up to this conference our concerns that if you adopted all the language from 2001, that's just not something we can sign up for. So if we have a clean start, a fresh start, we're happy to go. If you're incorporating a previous conference that we weren't involved with, that raised a whole set of objectionable provisions, then we couldn't participate, or it wouldn't be worth it for us to participate because we couldn't get past that particular issue.
The government document, but I wish I had the document in front of me, but the government document basically talks about, it doesn't talk about Palestinian by name, it just talks about the rights of people to not be oppressed in the way that they're oppressed. And it is clear that you're talking about Palestinians, okay? And it's there's only in a 50, 60 page document, there's maybe 3 paragraphs.
I think 2 or 3 paragraphs.
3 paragraphs. So, well, basically, let's say he's right. Let's adopt his worldview that that there was objectionable language in it. And so what he's saying is that language is so important that I will marginalize every other racial group in the United States because every other group wanted him to go. And so he's saying, I don't care about you African descendants. I don't care enough. I don't care enough about you. I don't care enough about Native Americans. I don't care enough about Latinos. I don't care enough about Asians because, stack it up, Israel's interest becomes more important than the interest of my citizens who were begging him to go. You know, and so, I mean, the thing is there, what I find objectionable is people always saying work through the system, work through the system. Well, do you get to cop out of the system whenever it doesn't go the way you want it to go? Yes, you do.
I have this question. I have this question for the panel. The Jamaican's envoy to the United Nations, Ambassador Raymond Wolf, he spearheaded an effort to have a permanent memorial at the UN that talks about, that pinpoints and shows the transatlantic slave trade. Now, I realized at the conference in 2001 that one of the languages that was put forth was to have slavery declared a crime against humanity. How do you feel about a permanent memorial at the United Nations, and will that in any way, how would it affect our people, you know, here and worldwide?
My thoughts are that anytime we can remind ourselves or remind the world about the Holocaust. I mean, if you see, I think one of the points that we just discussed, I think Israel and the media have done such a good job in literally promoting the Holocaust. I mean, and this is not to minimize the Holocaust at all, but they've done such a good job in promoting the Holocaust that it becomes a major political issue to even say anything. And this is the point that Professor Randall just made. Because of the Holocaust, this promotion of the Holocaust, all Israel has to say is that this conference against racism is anti-Semitic. That's all I have to say.
Right.
And then right away, what happens to the conference? We talk about all the world is dead. 189 nations is dead. And you just call it anti-Semitic. And what happens? The conference now is stigmatized. It looks as if folks are just, in fact, they say they're having a hate fest.
Right.
That's what they call the conference.
Right.
A hate fest. And so I think that if we can put our Holocaust up there, and like I said, I just mentioned Congo. We've lost 5 million in Congo, just in Congo in the last decade. If we can put our Holocaust up there, it clearly shows we're not trying to say that, you know, who has more suffering. No, it's just to remind that no one has a monopoly on suffering.
Right.
And that all of us have to be, we have to look at the Native American suffering, you know, their lives on reservations right now, you know, the future of their children. And so I think that some kind of memorial about the African Holocaust should be at the UN or any place we can set it out there to remind ourselves and remind the world that Israel does not have a monopoly on suffering here.
And I tell you someone that I really admire, David Taylor. He's a black man, and he went on this 40-day fast, you know, no food, just water, for 40 days of night straight. And of course, he did this along with prayer and Bible study because he was following in the footsteps of Jesus. And he prayed for this girl with full-blown AIDS, and she got healed instantly. And I thought that was an instance of, you know, getting rid of demonic or devil oppression. But I just wanted to throw that out there. Of course, he prayed for him in the name of Jesus.
I appreciate your comment, but I do have to say that I don't know whether there's a devil or not, but I know that all oppression that I experience is of people. And that if we deal with the people here, the devil won't be able to take no hold.
I would say people being used by the devil.
I have a comment. I wanted to ask Dr. Tway what he thought when he was speaking of the Holocaust and that it is recognized that it was a crime against Jewish people. How come people don't recognize enslavement the way that the Holocaust is recognized? Why? And it's particularly one of the most insidious forms of enslavement universally. Why don't people want to recognize that as part of the history of the United States? The way that they have been able to recognize the Jewish Holocaust. I don't understand it, and I want to know what you think.
I think that's a very good question, and it points to self-interest. You really have African Americans wanting, you know, not everyone, but a large number of African Americans wanting to forget this. They want to forget it. And the reason, I mean, as a psychologist, you know, if you've been traumatized, you don't want to keep remembering the trauma. So you have African Americans wanting to forget it, and you have whites who literally want to pretend that it never happened. So you have these two groups then coming together, you know, and literally you have this whole idea of literally forgetting that such major atrocity, or what we call ma'afa in African American psychology, has occurred. So it's this collaboration, and this is one of the key things. even on the continent of Africa, and we don't want to minimize it, but even on the continent of Africa and right in our own communities, we are constantly collaborating with our oppressors and with our own self-destruction. And so oftentimes when we are looking, even this issue about, when we're looking at our issues, we have to oftentimes look at ourselves and say, what is it that we are doing to correct this kind of problem or to promote this? Because oftentimes it is inaction or an attempt to forget that is allowing this problem to continue. On the continent of Africa, we got these African leaders running around, oftentimes literally collaborating with the very people who are oppressing us and causing our self-destruction. In fact, when I presented last Thursday with a colleague of mine who is from the Congo, he mentioned that, and you know, he reminded me that basically what is happening in Africa today is that for an African to become a leader of an African nation, that African literally has to be almost vetted by America and Europe, almost like they have to approve of you before you become a leader. If you do not get approved by them, and for some reason your people decide to elect you, you're taking your life in your own hands. That you will get assassinated. In fact, it has happened time and time again. So literally, you have this kind of issue of most of the major leaders in Africa today literally being surrogates for European and American interests. Neocolonialism.
I'd like to add this. When I lived and went to school in Ghana, in West Africa, they, the whole question of slavery, the whole topic of slavery was like it was a hush-hush thing. You know, nobody talked about it. Because I can remember when they showed the movie Roots at school at the University of Ghana, and it was, you know, this was the first time that some people had even seen anything. They had, you know, they had ever seen anything like this, and, you know, I mean, people just broke down crying, and, you know, they said they had never, you know, because it wasn't talked about. Because even like when I first went there in 1979, the slave castles, the factories of Cape Coast Castle, it was still being used as a penitentiary. You know, I talked to the people that were there. It wasn't a tourist site as such then, you know, because it was, you know, it was just something that they never talked about, and it was kind of erased from the people's minds. So this whole brainwashing thing is not just indigenous to this part of the world. You know, it's like a worldwide thing, and this is why you know, the whole concept of unity, it becomes such a frightening experience for those, you know, because that's the same thing, you know, like what we talking about when we're talking about genocide. Like 2/3 of the people in Namibia, what is now Namibia in Southwest Africa, 2/3 of the people there, the Herero people, they were wiped out. And so when they bring the question up about reparations and all that, they say, oh, that's old, you know, well, that's past. Let's not even talk about, you know, what happened. You know, when people talk about with the indigenization of the resources and things, you know, it's not for discussion, because cartels, you know, that manages the metals and the minerals is, you know, they don't even want no input. You know, so it's a serious thing. And like we were talking about the indigenization. Now, another declaration that was passed by the United Nations was called the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. You know, there was 4 countries that boycotted this. I mean, that voted no for this. You know, and that was Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand. But since that time, they have kind of reclaimed it, and the United States is the only one that, you know, because You know, it's a terrible situation, you know.
I don't even know why the United States don't sign it, because every human rights treaty that the United States signed, they sign it with so many reservations that they make it legally ineffective. They basically put on the International Convention on Elimination of all forms of discrimination, they put a reservation that said, oh, we got the best laws in the world. So our citizens have no more rights than the laws that we provide. They said, oh, we got the best courts in the world. So our citizens who want to complain about violations of human rights can't go to international human rights courts like other citizens of the world. And we sit around thinking that we have the best human rights record when we're just like China.
Right.
We are closed, segregated, ignorant, and don't even know that our country is committing major human rights violations because we've been taught to think that we are the best. You know, the American exceptionalism. And part of the problem, back to your question, is I teach race and racism in American law. I've been teaching it for 20 years. And this is one of the things I've learned about this. And I just finished teaching a class. And every year the people in the class say, how come I'm 25 years old in law school and just now learning this?
Right.
What I discovered is African Americans know very little of the real history of being African in this country and know nobody else's history. That everybody knows a little bit of their own history and practically none of nobody else's history. So when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade as a Holocaust, people think it's because of slavery. But it's really about 100 million people taken off the continent, stolen, and sold into slavery. 100 million, half of which died from the point that they were captured and before they reached the land of their enslavement. So we're talking about 50 million deaths. Okay, I got into a squabble with this white professor, and he says, oh, your estimate's too high. It wasn't 100 million, it was more like 60 million. I'm like, okay, 20 million, 40 million or so.
Right.
You know, you're still talking about 30 million who died. Think about if 30 million Americans died in the context, now it was over years, but died from one single thing that was occurring to Americans. What kind of energy would be put into saying, oh my God, this is a Holocaust that is happening to us. We got to figure out what to do. So part of what I think is that most people really don't, they think about slavery, but they don't understand the scope of what really people of African descent, nobody really understands. The average person doesn't understand the scope of what happened to the African continent, the scope of what happened to people of African descent. You know, I teach healthcare law. One of the things I talk about is that people didn't step off the ships healthy. The ones that didn't die was sick as hell when they got here. A lot of them died and never got any further. Most of the people don't understand the history was take all the people to the Caribbean islands. They didn't come straight from Africa to the United States continent. You know, it's kind of like if you want to sell sick cattle, you got to at least get them looking decent. Who wants to buy something that looks like it's going to die in a minute? So they would take the enslaved people who were left to the Caribbean islands to do several things. One, to get them healthier fatten them up, to get them looking like they weren't on death rows. 2, to sort them into different groups because different countries had different ideas about who made good slaves. And so there were certain kind of slaves, people didn't come from certain kinds of countries that they didn't want coming to America or to wherever. And 3, America was vicious in its effort not to have any traces of African history. And so the deculturization that was necessary for enslaved people coming to Africa started there. The getting rid of the language, getting rid of anything. Well, it wasn't true in all parts of South America. There were parts of South America where, you know, you can go there today and there's heavy generational evidence of being African descendants from certain tribes and stuff. But America is very, very vicious in the idea that we don't want people having any trace of any tribe, any language, that sort of thing. And that's why I say we're indigenous to this country.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. I want to know, you spoke about maybe using the city of Dayton as a case study for your World Summit. I want to know, is there a media outlet for Black people to speak truth to power in the city of Dayton and surrounding areas? And is there maybe a fear of speaking truth to power? Because you mentioned earlier that a lot of the United States, they disagree with a lot of the things that you want to do. So I guess my question is, how do you make that breakthrough? Yes. And what do people do to support you? I guess
Thank you. That's a pretty loaded question and multi-layered. I'm not sure that I'm quite capable to answer it all. I think that what's the Dayton, the TV station that's Access TV. I think that's a good place where you can find a lot of anti-establishment kinds of things going on. You know, if you're talking about the mainstream media, no. They were, you know, in order, and I have to say that there is a sense, and we all know this, that to the extent that you rise successfully in a mainstream establishment, a historically white establishment, or a minority establishment that is going after historically white money, that in order to be successful, you have to appear as much like them as possible. Okay? Now there is a certain point, like, you know, like I'm not going to give my age away, but I'm old enough to all y'all grandmas, almost all of y'all. So there's a certain point when you can get your career established, and maybe you haven't shot in your foot so bad that just by being around long enough. And one of the things I tell my son is that he's now a law professor down in FAMU, and I say that no matter what you do, protect your voice. Because your voice, once you lose your voice, it's almost impossible to get it back. And so you make decisions that will allow you to protect your voice, whatever that is. Now, why don't we have, part of the problem is so many people have lost their voice. You know, and it's not a blame thing. I mean, you know, I was a single parent with 2 children, and when you're struggling to feed your children, and you're working, and you're doing all of that. But I personally don't think it takes a lot. I think that this is more than enough in this room right now. That being of the generation of the Civil Rights Movement, one of the myths of the Civil Rights Movement is all these people were involved. I wasn't involved. You know, my parents weren't involved. My neighborhood wasn't involved. We looked on the TV and said, those black people must be crazy. You know? And so it only takes it takes a committed few to raise enough of a voice to make the establishment uncomfortable that they will move a little in the way that you want because they are afraid of what it may mean if they don't. I think that we can pull together, I think we can do something really wonderful in terms of voices of data, sort of shadow reports, saying, you know, and confronting the United States in a way that is not technical, because they're used to dealing with people like me. They're used to dealing with reports and statistics and stuff. They know how to deal with that. I think they will be in shock to have real people, not that I ain't real, but to have people who are living it in their community coming before the international human rights. And I think that we can work together to keep people informed, to plan it, and for people who want to be involved in some way. I don't think it takes a lot to get it started. I think it just takes people coming out when we need you to come out, and then building upon, bringing in your background, your expertise to build upon it. And I guess I've taken on a project for the next year.
Yes, Steve Muhammad from Knowledge for Life, and there's Knowledge for Life does have a black internet radio station, knowforlife.org, and that's with a number 4, knowforlife.org, and we're getting that going and established. Number of different questions, but the first conference I wanted to just remind or bring to light that Colin Powell was sent to the first conference, and he was one that, you know, walked out with the Jewish.
Day he was there.
Yeah, with the Jewish delegate, following right behind him, as the United States often does. About the media, Professor Tway, I wanted to ask you 2 questions, and how the media is covering up things that are going on the continent of Africa, and one is about Monsanto, and how they are using genetically modified seeds to basically own the land. And another one is the recent lawsuit that the family of Patrice Lumumba, which, there you go, Patrice Lumumba, the 50th anniversary just passed, and his family is suing the United States, and of course the media has said nothing about it. But if you could possibly talk about the Monsanto.
Again, as I pointed out before, I'm not completely familiar with that particular case, but I've heard of instances where U.S. corporate interests is moved into Africa and have created these genetic altered seed, and is literally have patented and is trying to get African farmers to become completely dependent on them. That means that, and you can't hide the seeds or nothing, because they own it. They own the seeds.
Right.
And so, in fact, they even have inspectors, you know, checking your production and all that. And it just so happens that these seeds are able to a large extent, I think, produce more of them. They can tend to survive in insects and all of that. So some farmers are trying to get high yields by using these seeds. But you literally have American corporate interests now going into literally owning African farm products in this way here. And oftentimes they offer these seeds initially as gifts or donation. Okay? This is one of the things that has happened throughout Africa. I remember growing up in Monrovia that all of a sudden, it was early 90s, all of a sudden, we started going to school, we started getting free milk, free cornmeal, bags. We're talking about bags. We didn't ask for it, but we're getting it for free. And it's all U.S. donated. Free. Every child gets a bag of cornmeal, a bag of milk, and the point is we're happy to get it, not realizing that this was an attempt to undercut our agriculture production.
Right.
Because if families are getting free things, then the farmers who grow the food, I mean, who's going to buy it? Because the stuff is free. And in fact, the free things that we were getting, it ended up on the street because this is what the vendors were buying and reselling, so farmers quit growing food because the food, they flooded our schools with free food.
Yeah, I like to add on to that. When you talked about the GMO, it serves two purposes. The first one is that when they plant the GMO, that these seeds don't reproduce themselves, you see. And so what Monsanto then do, like they have the monopoly on it, that you could only go back to them to get these seeds. But the main thing what the GMO does is in any seeds that are planted in a place that's not indigenous to it, it tears up the soil. And this is one of the reasons why, like when you look and you say, wow, Africa can't feed itself. That's not true, because what has happened is that the crops that are and the things that are indigenous to a particular area have been replaced. Like Brother was talking about when they were passing out the food and things, that happened to us in the South. Our people were the greatest of farmers and agriculturalists, but after they start giving away free food and paying people what they call the soil bank not to grow food, then in a generation, and then in a few years, these skills wasn't passed on, and this is the situation that we find ourselves in now. We find ourselves, after a period of the so-called Black Power period, we find ourselves de-skilled, and so when you look around and you look at the cities that we have migrated to, why they're tore up. The people that built them, like my father and the people before them that built them, they had skills. They knew how to do things. We were told, no, don't work with your hands, don't do this, don't do that. So we became de-skilled, and as a result, we can't even do anything, you see. So that's one of the tricks that has been played, in order to get hold of the land. Like I used to say, I told you when I lived in Africa, I told them, I said, why did you fill up your well that y'all been drinking out of this well for thousands and thousands of years? But the people tell you, no, you don't need that. We'll build a tap and things. And then they're the only ones that got the technology, so when it breaks down, you without water, where you have been having water for centuries and a millennium.
I mean, that's two stories I want to relate. One, when I was a nurse, one was something that was happening on the continent of Africa with U.S.-related babies, and the other one was Alaskan natives. And U.S. companies are still trying to do this. For those of us who've had babies, you get these free gifts. Okay, and one of the free gifts was formula. Nestle. And so what would happen is they would give free gifts out to mothers like they do. The mothers would use the Nestle formula, and guess what? It was enough formula to last until the milk dried up. Then their natural milk would dry up, and they would have to buy formula.
Right.
But being poor, the formula was too expensive. So what they would do is water it down. And so there was all this malnourishment going on to babies that was directly traceable to Nestle giving away formula. There was a big push, this was in the 70s, a big push to get Nestle to stop the practice because there was really an epidemic of malnourished babies who should otherwise be healthy.
Right.
Okay. Many countries signed on. The United States refused to sign on to it because while in principle, and I love this about us, we're always for something in principle, we just won't take action on it. While in principle, we can't tell companies how to conduct their business. Right. And that is still pretty much our mode of operation. We, in principle, will not like something a company do, but we have a bigger principle, which is capitalism, and not telling people how to conduct their companies. The other example, which is I saw this happen firsthand. I was a public health nurse in Alaska at the time. And the scenario that you all were talking about happening in some of the villages in Africa happened. Well, what happened is the United States made a decision to start welfare. So they declared an income level at which you qualified for welfare. Okay? And so, guess what? Everyone in a village qualified for welfare because it wasn't a currency economy. It was and so what then, lo and behold, some non-indigenous person, 99.9% of the time white, would open up a little store in this community, and they would ship in food that people had money to buy because they had the welfare. But the welfare wasn't enough to cover their entire needs, and so they ended up not engaging in the work they were. I'm losing the track. Their work was about raising the food, catching the food that they needed to survive.
Self-sufficient.
When they got this welfare check in which they could buy food, they no longer had work.
Dependent.
And they no longer had skills that could be sold anywhere else. And so then the alcoholism rose because then people started trying to leave the village to come to Fairbanks. And this is where my house was. And Fairbanks was like a foreign town to them. And so there was all kinds of problems. So it was destruction of a culture based on this sort of, we can make money. We can, and I have to tell you that we're undergoing that now. This whole privatization of everything is the destruction of the American society and the forming of a dependent society. There are things that the government should do because when you privatize it, profit drives the provision, and then once it's gone, once schools are gone, then people who don't have the money to go to school won't be able to go to school because there are no public schools around. Once you have hospitals gone, then people won't be able to go because there's no, you have to ask yourself, what happens to people who don't have money when we privatize order?
Right.
And that's what they have tried to do in some countries.
That's what they got going on.
And they actually had riots because people said, you're not going to privatize our water. But we're in the midst of this kind of, let's see what we can privatize and how much we can privatize. And I think the American society should say that is not a road we want to go down. We think that there things ought to be by the government because we want everyone to have it. You know, everyone don't need an IP player or a DVD player, but everyone needs education, healthcare, food, and housing. And if we have to privatize it to assure that they get it, then we'll do that.
This will be the last question, and we'll have a final thought from our panel and facilitator.
Peace. I want to first thank the panel and the facilitator for taking time today to educate me. But my question is, at what point do we consider the possibility that the same government that has never represented us will never represent us and take the power of educating and entertaining and indoctrinating our youth and our families? At what point do we detach and accept the idea of Amos Wilson, which is, I'm all for diversity, but I'm not against being a separationist simply for the means of raising my children with some kind of cultural relevance? Because in my short years on this earth, I've yet to find an instance where, you know, the protests and the conferences and the conventions really got the work done that we needed to be done, because these people had never given us any respect or value. So why would we expect them to start now? Why would we continue to fight for that?
Well, I don't think I'm not fighting for respect. I don't really care whether you respect me or not. I'm fighting for goods and services. And the reason why we have to keep fighting is that no matter how many people go into, I'm going to raise and educate my own, I've done a good job. I mean, I've got one son is a law professor, and I have another son who's a world traveler in the fine arts. I could say, you know, I'm upper middle class. I've raised my son to be activists and analysts, and we're doing fine. The problem, though, is we live in a system in which anybody with a black skin can get marginalized at a minute's notice. And if we don't work on changing that, then what we're saying is we'll go off and be separate. Okay, they ain't gonna let you. You can't, you know, unless you want to go into the backwoods like some of the militia do, like some of the white supremacists do, or the Mormons, unless you want to really separate yourself completely from society and become a cult, you are going to be subject to the laws and regulations of this society, and that we have to change the system. I don't agree with you that things haven't changed. I grew up not being able to get food. I grew up not being able to go to a bathroom when we went on trips. I grew up in a 2-room black school. My grandfather was a slave. My grandfather, think about that. So over the long course of my family's only just a couple of generations, we've seen a lot of change. The problem is that it takes a long time, and for a lot of people, you know, like my grandfather didn't see the end of Jim Crow, okay? But I did. Now we got something else that we've got to work on, okay? The problem, I think being a nationalist is fine, and people who want to do it, I'm not knocking it. But what I'm saying is everybody ain't going to want to do it. And even if you do want to do it, if you do it within the borders of this country, you're always going to be subject to their laws, their regulation, and their white supremacists. And so we have to work, no matter how hard, frustrating, and impossible it seems, we have to work on changing it. And maybe we only change it a little bit at a time, but I do believe that I would not be sitting here if my dad and my grandfather had given up and said, you know, this Jim Crow is going to last forever. why my grandfather was, like I said, he was born in slavery in 1902. He made a decision, my dad hadn't even been born yet. He made a decision to move his family from West Texas to East Texas so that his kids could live across the street from a school so that they could get educated. That education that his kids didn't help him. And they suffered through Jim Crow even with an education. But my life is significantly better because he made those decisions and fought those fights. And so the reason I think we have to fight those fights is because even if some people pull out, there are still people who are going to be subject to the system, and we need to make a change, no matter how difficult it is going to be.
I'm not supporting nationalism in that sense of separating. I mean in the sense of having our own schools in our communities, like you're saying, the grocery stores in our communities, things that we need in order to have our own power versus going across town to go to their grocery store.
I think